So you're saying seems quite intense to do sprint training and vertical training and strength training. How would you add sprint training, for example, to a volleyball player during a week? So if you imagine from the previous part of the question, where you're talking about max vertical jump being their sport specific activity and everything they're going to do around that is going to support the ability to jump higher, you need to think about what it is you need to possess for volleyball. And you have a couple more qualities that you need at the same time while doing your sport specific activity. So vertical jumping is Isaiah's sport. He needs to be able to jump as high as possible when he's peaking for his jump. That's essentially that main quality. You need more skill available to you. You need to be able to play. I'm not sure how long volleyball games are, but you have a season of volleyball games. You have multiple sessions, multiple training sessions during the week. So you need to bring in the idea of an in-season and an off-season. And this is the thing we've been talking about for years, which is that kind of periodization of training and making sure that you're peaking for certain things, certain qualities in the right times throughout the year. So if you would look at this in terms of strength training, vertical training, and sprint training, how we would typically phrase this or structure this for that athlete is in the off season, in the start of the off season, assuming you're reasonably fresh, you're not injured, and you're ready to get a good training block in, and hopefully with somewhere between maybe 8 to 16 weeks, if at all possible. Your initial goal is a higher volume phase, general physical preparedness. You're doing some kind of conditioning. Now, you need to be careful in a sport like volleyball, where you're probably well conditioned, that you don't keep hammering that same style of conditioning. So in this case, we'll probably change it up. For example, we had Cameron McAvoy last year. He said like the 50-meter fastest time freestyle. He did the assault bike and he really enjoyed it, which is obviously a different mode of doing conditioning compared to obviously sprinting in the pool. So the initial section, we're trying to build up this base physical capacity. Then you bring in your strength training peak. So you get the initial block of training done, however long you've available to this. You bring up those physical capacities. Then you make more of a focus on your strength training. Now, all the while you're still practicing your vertical jumps or plyometrics to a certain degree and what makes sense in that side of training and what your weaknesses are and what you can tolerate with your strength training and what you can tolerate sprint training wise for that. So in your off season, there's not going to be as much plyometric and sprint training in the initial portion. Then you move on to the strength portion. You're going to drop some of that volume. You're going to drop some of that conditioning to a degree and see what's sustainable. Then you try and peak your strength. And then you try shortly after, probably in this kind of pre-season phase or at the end of your off season, where you will try and peak your vertical and your sprint training, if it's relevant to you in your volleyball career, where you reduce the volume, but not so much the intensity of the strength training. And then once you finish that off season, you should hopefully have had a strength PB over a certain number of things that you think are useful to you, probably the squat, probably an RDL. Hopefully you have a vertical PB or you're back to your old numbers. And hopefully you have a sprint PB or you're back to old numbers on the distance you think is useful for you. Then your goal then in the in season is to maintain this as much as possible and not try and progress it. So you really have to structure that training. And again, this probably comes back to what I was talking about a couple of minutes ago, where okay, the idea behind things is relatively straightforward. What I just described there took probably a minute to describe, but the nuance and the structure in doing that is much more complicated, and getting that right is tough. So that's the general principle of what you need to do. Obviously, structuring that is much more complicated in season, off season to make it right, but that's the general idea.